My name is Dr. Sergio Uribe, Associate Professor, and together with Dr. Maldupa, we will discuss the ethical aspects to be considered when planning, executing, and disseminating medical research. So, at the end of this class, it is expected that you are able to identify the ethical guidelines of medical research, to identify all the regulations guiding medical research, and you are able to recognize some major ethical issues in research. So, the clinical research aims to diagnose, treat, and essentially prevent a disease or condition in a group of individuals. However, to obtain information about which interventions are most effective, it is required that at some point these new interventions are required to be tested in humans. So several issues arise here. For example, who should be tested on, for example. And everyone has an innate sense of right and wrong. Also, societies have rules and laws that define what can be done and what is prohibited. Many of these rules are learned either, for example, in the family or at school or during life. However, the development of new technologies and research methods, as well as the emergence of new disease, makes it sometimes unclear who should or should not be, or what should or shall not be done in medicine. For example, should we develop a diagnostic method for degenerative diseases that have no cure? Or should we develop a test to detect Alzheimer in children, for example? Will that be ethical? These are the kind of questions that ethicists discuss. Note that these are different questions from scientific ones. A scientific question, for example, will be, what is the best diagnostic method for Alzheimer? While an ethical question will be, should we develop a diagnostic method for Alzheimer if we, for example, doesn't have the cure yet? So we can distinguish two areas of application of ethics. First place, the professional ethics, which deals with questions related to professional practice, and the research ethics. So here the research ethics seeks to resolve two fundamental questions. In first place, if we should do research in humans, and also if we should do this research, how this research must be carried out. So while this may seem to be a question of, it's actually, it's important that we review a little brief of history to understand how this concept has arrived to what we understand as ethics in research today. Well, for example, during the Second World War, the German doctors experimented with prisoners of war to assess, for example, how long a person survived in cold water, or the effect of different types of clothing on survival time. For this purpose, they immersed the prisoners in tanks of cold water and measured the time it took them to lose consciousness and then to afterwards to die. So these experiments were obviously carried out without respecting the will of the patient. On the other hand, in Japan, a very specialist unit known as Unit 731 studied that we know today as biological warfare. It is worth mentioning that while most of the German doctors who participated in the experiments were prosecuted and punished after the war, the Japanese counterparts made a very different fate. After being captured by the Americans, they were granted immunity in exchange for sharing the results of their research. Example, this has said is the Tuskegee study. This was carried out from 39 to 72. And this was conducted with public funds from the United States. So, as said here, a group of researchers deliberately infected Black men and women and children, all and adults, with syphilis, and then controlled them to time, making them believe they will receive treatment. The truth is that they never received any kind of treatment because the researchers were interested in knowing the natural history of the disease. And even more, a few years ago, a researcher who was looking for information about this study found by chance that a group of researchers had previously been in Guatemala, where they conducted similar studies. When this became known, the president of United States at such time, Barack Obama, had to call the Guatemalan president Alvaro Colom to apologize. And this is the picture of the moment. Another noteworthy study is the Willowbrook School in the United States in the 60s. At this school, researchers created a whole new wing, telling parents that their children could be admitted in the school to this new wing, to this new facility, only if they agreed to participate in a medical study. In the study, the children were infected with hepatitis and then tested for different treatments with gamma globulins. In their defense, afterwards, the researchers argued that hepatitis was epidemic and that the children were going to get it anyway. So it was preferable that they get it in a controlled environment. In dentistry, there are also some examples of studies that could not be carried out today due to ethical limitations. Maybe the most famous is a series of studies carried out in a hospital for mentally ill and disabled patients in the Swedish town of Vipeholm during the 50s. At the time, it was not clear what was the cause of dental caries. So a series of studies with different nutrients were carried out. In one of these studies, the patients were fed a diet rich in different types of sugars, for example, solid and liquid or viscous. And also, they test if the moment of the ingestion, I mean, during or between meals. At the time, it was not known what caused the caries. And that study provided experimental evidence that allowed to identify the main cause of dental caries, actually, that is sugars. It should be noted that currently, for example, from Europe, the Nordic countries have the lowest caries rate among developed countries. So they incorporate the result of these studies into public health policies. But there are also another kind of issues in medical studies today. For example, in 2005, our research that is from Norway, named John Sudbo, published in a very prestigious medical journal, The Lancet, a study showing that non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs may have an effect against oral cancer. The article was read by the director of the Oslo hospital, where the patients came from, and the director noticed that the data did not fit with the amount of patients that they have in certain moment of time. So when confronted, Sadbo acknowledged that he had made up the data, and the article was later retracted. So retraction occurs when a published study is found to have a serious methodological flaw or a problem that reflects, for example, the research misconduct, such as manipulation of data or plagiarism or fabrication of data. But unfortunately, the problem of questionable publications that have to be retracted is on the rise, as this graph published in the Nature journal in 2011 shows. The origin of these retractions can be seen at the bottom, and we can see that 44% correspond to inappropriate behavior by researchers, such as fabrication or falsification of data. Another ethical problem is self-plagiarism, which consists, for example, of sending two identical papers to two different journals or using material that has been previously published, while plagiarism consists of passing off someone else's ideas as if they were one's own. On the other hand, the remaining 56% of the retractions are mostly due to honest mistakes. For example, when a researcher realized after submitting an article for publication that there was an error in some calculation or table or figure. The problem has become so endemic that the mainstream media has begun to express concern about the consequences that these shortcomings in medical research may have on medical practice and on the credibility of researchers. And there are some examples from The Guardian in England and from Vox in USA. So even more, there is even a blog dedicated exclusively to reporting the retracts, where more and more retracts from data journals, for example, are appearing every day. So historically, society has reacted to these problems by discussing and agreeing on standards governing research. The first of these international norms emerged after World War II and placed a strong emphasis on respecting patient autonomy to prevent it from happening again, all the things that we discussed in the Second World War. However, this first rule also created problems, as it did not make clear how voluntary patients could these voluntary patients could be obtained from vulnerable groups, such, for example, children or prisoners, because sometimes you cannot get the conscious agreement to participate. For example, if you want to measure something that some emergency treatment for people who has undergone, for example, a strong cerebral trauma, and these people lie without conscience, how it's not possible to access to get this consent. So for this reason, after a congress held by the World Medical Association in the city of Helsinki in the 54, an ethical standard was promulgated that is the most internationally recognized even nowadays. This standard emphasized the need for independent review, and so today almost all health institutions have a scientific ethics committee or institutional review board that reviews and regulates all the research conducted within each institution. This code of ethics is sometimes reviewed to incorporate new regulations that allow research to be carried out considering advances in knowledge, or incorporating, for example, regulations about the use of stem cells or genetic material. Afterward, the Belmont Report emphasized three ethical principles, namely respect for the people, charity, and justice. However, many pharmaceutical companies found ways to circumvent these standards by, for example, conducting research in countries that had not signed international agreements. For example, many North American and European pharmaceutical companies started clinical studies in India or Central or South America and Southeast Asia countries. So to fill this gap, the Council for International Organizations of Medical Science, together with the World Health Organization, published an international ethics guide that extends these standards to developing countries and legislate on compensation for armed costs to patients for countries other than the researchers own.